morning. We are in Maseches Shviis, Perek Daled, Mishnah Aleph. In the Mishnah Behira, it's page 431. And in this Mishnah, we're going to begin to get a historical understanding of perhaps the Maris Ayin issue. What prompted Chazal? We learned Perek Beis, Perek Gimel. How much manure can you take out to the field? Can you open a quarry? Can you remove rocks from your field? Can you take down a fence in your field? We learned all these questions, and the basis of the question was Maris Ayin. If you do these things during Shemitah, people will suspect that what you're doing is you're preparing your field for planting during Shemitah, and through that, people will say, if Reuben can do it, I can do it. It seems to be okay. And we have this Maris Ayin problem. Today we're going to get a bit of a historical perspective of the problem that Chazal were dealing with, and the problem comes from an unusual place. I'm not sure any of us thought about this place before we read this Mishnah, but it's coming from what we would consider an unusual place, and Chazal had to deal with this problem. So on page 431 of the Mishnah Behira, Perek Daled, Mishnah Aleph. And the Mishnah is going to talk about, again, removing stone, sticks, pebbles from your field during Shemitah. And now we talked about that in the last Perek, and now we're going to get a historical perspective of where the whole sugya starts. Barishona, originally, before Chazal made any takonos, before Chazal made any rules about removing stones, sticks, pebbles from your field, Hayu Omrim, they would say, the rule was, Malaket Adam Eitzim Va'avonim Va'asavim Mitok Shalo, a person was allowed to remove, collect sticks, twigs, rocks, grass. He was allowed to take these things out of his field. Grass probably really means weeds. You're allowed to take out the weeds. You're allowed to take out the rock. You're allowed to take out the twigs that are in your field during Shemitah. Now you have to wait for a couple of seconds to get the full historical connotation. Kederech shehu malaket mitoich shel chaveroi. The same way you're allowed to take sticks, pebbles from your friend's field. Remember, we emphasized in the last Perek the prohibition to remove rocks from a field is only if it's your field, because people looking at what you're doing will believe and assume that the rocks and the sticks, etc., that you're picking up and collecting for your field is in order to prepare the field for planting during Shemitah. And therefore, you can't do this during Shemitah. You can't gather rocks and take them out of your field during Shemitah. However, if you remember, we learned if the rocks are a certain size, it takes two people to pick up a rock. We learned all those halachas. But the halacha was that a person couldn't lift up rocks and remove them from his field. But Shimon, if he has permission from Reuven, he can go into Reuven's field and lift up any size rocks, because no one is going to assume that Shimon is getting Reuven's field ready for planting. They will understand that Shimon is removing the rocks because Shimon needs rocks for construction purposes. The same way we learned yesterday that a kablan, a person that's involved in construction, he can remove any size rocks from his own field, because people understand that he's a kablan. He needs rocks, he needs stone for his work. So we learned that there were three halachas. The three halachas were a person in his own field, a person in someone else's field, and a kablan. The kablan is the simplest halacha. A kablan can go into his own field and collect all the rocks he wants because the people that know him understand that he's collecting rocks because he needs it for a job he's doing, but not because he's clearing his field to plant. That's simple. The person who goes into someone else's field, he can pick up any rocks because no one's going to think that he's picking up the rocks to prepare someone else's field for planting. The last case is the more difficult case. Someone wants to go into his own field and collect the rocks. So there we said that if it's small pebbles, he can't do it. If it's huge rocks, and then we had a machlokes, what huge rocks are, what's the size of a huge rock. But in your own field, you can lift up huge rocks. Okay, those are the three halachas. Now the Mishnah says on page 431 through 432, before all these rules were put into place by Chazal, the rule was malaket adam eitzim va'avonim va'asove mitoich shaloi kiderech shu malaket mitoich shel chaveroi es hagas gas. The original rule was the same way a person can go into someone else's field and collect any type of rock, big, small. The original rule was that in your own field, you can pick up large rocks. In someone else's field, you are allowed to pick up any size rocks. There's no suspicion you're preparing the field for planting. And in your own field, you can only pick up gas, big stones. That was the original rule. So if you take a look at picture 104 on page 432, the top of the picture says Borishona, the original rule. If you go to the left side of the page, stay Chavero. You're going into your friend's field. Underneath the picture, it says, Besod she'ena shaloi, a field that's not yours. Mutaloi lilkait bein eitzim vavonim gasim bein eitzim vavonim dakim. You're allowed to collect big sticks, big stones, small stones from someone else's field. Because if you're picking up these things in someone else's field, you're certainly not preparing the field for planting. It's not your field. So that's the original rule in someone else's field. Now let's go to the right side in picture 104. At the top of the picture, it says Soda Shalom, your own field. Eitzim vavonim, right above the picture, it says Eitzim vavonim dakim osoloi lilkoit shirnir misakin sadeyu. You can't pick up little rocks and little twigs because it looks like you're preparing the field for planting. Right underneath the picture, it says Eitzim vavonim gasim, big sticks and big rocks, mutaloi lilkoit, even a person who owns the field can take those out of the field. It doesn't look like he's preparing his field for planting. If he was preparing his field for planting, he would be picking up the small rocks and the small twigs also. But if he's only picking up the big rocks and the big twigs, and he's leaving behind the small rocks and the small twigs, he's not getting the field ready for planting. There's no maris ayin. It's clear that he needs the rocks for construction. He needs twigs to start a fire, no problem. So that's the top, picture 104, Borishona. Originally in someone else's field, if you go into someone else's field, obviously with his permission, you can collect all the rocks, you can collect all the twigs, any size. In your own field, you can only collect and remove the big twigs and the big rocks. The small twigs and the big rocks you have to leave behind, so nobody will suspect that you're preparing your field for planting. Misharabu ovre avera. We had this language earlier in the Masechta. When the number of people who are ovre avera, they violated the rules of Shemitah. When there was a tremendous increase in those who violated the rules of Shemitah, Hiskino, Chazal made the new rule. Shehei zeh malaket mitoich shel zeh, v'zeh malaket mitoich shel zeh, that each person is allowed to pick in someone else's field, but no one's allowed to pick in their own field. Unlike the original rule, where in your own field you were allowed to pick up big rocks and big twigs, but you left behind the small ones. After the violators of Shemitah became so numerous, and we'll soon see what they did, but after the violators of Shemitah became so numerous, Chazal stopped that practice, and they said, the owner of a field cannot collect big stones, small stones, anything, period. With a parenthesis that I'll fill it in a few moments. A person under the new rule, when the violators of Shemitah became so numerous, Chazal had to deal with that problem. And therefore they said the owner of a field who used to be able to collect and remove from his field big rocks and big twigs, now he can't remove anything from his own field. The only thing that can be done is that you can go into someone else's field, and when you go into someone else's field with permission of the owner, you can collect only the big rocks and the big twigs. So, under the old rule, a person was allowed to collect big rocks and big rocks and big twigs in his own field, but not small ones. Under the new rule, a person that owns a field cannot collect anything in his own field, not even the big rocks or the big twigs. Under the original rule, you were allowed to go into someone else's field with his permission and collect big, small, whatever you wanted. Under the new rule, going into someone else's field, you were only allowed to collect the big rocks and the big stones. So if you go down to the bottom of the page of 432, you have picture 105. Misharabu over of the laws of Shemitah tremendously increased. They made a new rule, a new takana. Right side of the page. Sadeh Shalom, in your own field. You see, it says at the top of the picture, Eina Malake Dakim, you cannot collect small stones and small twigs. At the bottom of the picture says, Eina Malake Gasim, you can't even collect the big rocks and the big twigs, nothing. In your own field, after the new rule was put into place, you collect nothing from your own field. Again, there's a parenthesis that I'll add when we come to the end of this discussion. So with the new rule, in your own field, you collect no rocks and no twigs. Left side, picture 105, stay Havera. With permission, you can go into someone else's field, and you see at the top of the picture, it says, Eina Malake Dakim. You cannot collect small twigs and small rocks in your friend's field. You look at the bottom of the picture, it says, Mutar lo lilkot gasim. You're allowed to collect the big rocks and the big stones of someone else's field. So again, the original rule was in your field, you can collect the big rocks and the big twigs, but not the small ones. The new rule was you can't collect anything in your field, even the big rocks and the big twigs. The original rule was that if you go into someone else's field with permission, you can pick up whatever you want, big or small. The new rule was when you go into someone else's field, you can only pick up the big and not the small. Now, what was the problem here? What's the Rabu over Avera? What was the terrible Avera that these sinners were doing? So if you take a look in the Rav, at the top of page 432, left-hand side, top of page 432, top line, it says in bold, Misharabu over Avera, when the violators of Shemitah became so numerous, What did they do? Shehoyu malaktim besodoseim ben dakim ben gasim vem oimrim begasim likatnu. What the people began doing is they would, under the original rule, you were allowed to collect in your own field the big rocks and the big sticks, but not the small ones. It became prevalent slowly but surely that people would collect the big rocks and the big sticks and the small rocks and the small sticks in their own field. And if someone would say to them, what happened to your field? Yesterday it had rocks and sticks all over the place, and today it looks clean. So the person, the owner of the field, would say, I cleaned it up. It was all big rocks and big sticks. I didn't touch the small ones. They were all considered big. Having heard that, the person who owned a field and had asked this question would say, oh, my next door neighbor, he cleaned his field yesterday of all the rocks and all the stones because he decided that all the rocks and all the stones in his field were considered big. So he cleaned the whole field up. You know what? All the rocks and all the stones in my field are also considered big. I'll clean them all up too. And then someone else looked on and said, I have two neighbors that cleaned up all their rocks and all their sticks. And they claimed that they were big rocks and big sticks. I'm going to clean up my field also of all the big rocks and all the big sticks. And this is how the process of Maris Ayin continues, except here we have Ovri Aveira. The first couple of people who started this process knew what they were doing was wrong. They were collecting the big stones and the small stones, the big sticks and the small sticks, and they were telling people everything was big. That's why I did it. So when these people became so numerous and they knew they were violating Shemitah and they were making up phony excuses, there were no small sticks, there were no more small rocks, it was all big. So Chazal had to institute a new rule because by cleaning up the whole field, it clearly is a Maris Ayin that you're preparing the field to plant. And it very well may be that these people who are Ovri Aveira, these sinners, that was actually what they wanted to do. They cleaned up the field of the big rocks and the small rocks. They can prepare it for planting. And onlookers said, oh, he cleaned up his field. I can also clean up my field. And the phony excuse that all the rocks and all the sticks were big, there were no small ones, a phony excuse, but nobody knew it. And so you have this slow process of everyone starting to clean up their fields of the big rocks, the small rocks, the big twigs and the small twigs, and people are going to start preparing their fields to plant in Shemitah. And Chazal said, end, stop. From now on, in your own field, you're not allowed to pick up anything. So if yesterday your field was filled with rocks and stones, and today your field is clean, and your neighbor says to you, what happened? He can't say, well, I collected the big ones. That's not going to be an answer because the big ones are prohibited as well. And therefore, everybody would know that this person violated the halachas, the rabbinic halachas of Shemitah, and this is the person that you don't copy. He violated the laws of Shemitah. He violated the rabbanon of collecting rocks. So in your own field, zero. You collect nothing. Now let's come to the parentheses that we spoke about. There remains a parenthesis. In your own field, if there are avnei kosef, those massive stones, the stones that Reb Meir said, we learned yesterday, Reb Meir said it's so big that you would need two hands to pick it up and put it on your shoulder. Rabbi Yossi said that it's 2 or 3 stones that you pick up and you would have to use 2 hands and put on your shoulder. Those kind of massive stones remain permitted to pick up in your own field. Avnei kosef, the shoulder stones, however you define shoulder stones, that remain permitted to pick up in your field even after the takana. Nobody is going to be able to come up with a phony excuse that he had rocks all over his field, and there were pebbles and small rocks, and he's going to be able to say, all my rocks were shoulder rocks. They were so big and heavy, it took a shoulder to be able to remove it. And his neighbor says, listen, I saw your field yesterday. There were small rocks, there were pebbles, they weren't shoulder rocks. What are you talking about? You're over on Shemitah. So those massive kind of rocks, they remain permitted to pick up and remove from your field. But if it's not that massive rock, then after the takana, you pick up nothing from your fields. You can't come up with a phony excuse that all my rocks were big and all my twigs were big. If you go into your friend's field, you can pick up only big rocks and big twigs, not small ones. Why can't you pick up the small ones? So let's now read that part of the Mishnah. Page 432, Misharabu Ovre Avera, when the people who violate Shemitah became so numerous, Hiskinu shehezeh malaket mitoich shel zeh, v'zeh malaket mitoich shel zeh. The takana was, in your own field you pick up nothing, parentheses, except the shoulder stones. Otherwise you pick up nothing. But you can go into your friend's field and pick up large rocks, but not small ones. Why? Because Chazal, in their ingenuity, understood that when you're dealing with Yidden, and you're dealing with Yidden who know a little, Yidden that know a little, big blam donim. So Reuven and Shimon have fields next to each other, and Reuven and Shimon are talking, and they say, you know, did you get word yesterday? Chazal, Chachamim, you go back into those days, and Reuven and Shimon are having a discussion. Did you hear there's a new rule? You're not allowed to pick up any rocks and any twigs in your own field, but you're allowed to pick up rocks and twigs in your neighbor's field. So Reuven says to Shimon, I got an idea. I'll pick up all the big rocks and all the big stones and all the small rocks and all the small stones in your field. And you pick up all the big rocks and all the small stones in my field. And this way, we're at the same place. I can't pick up anything in my field. You can't pick up anything in your field. But you pick up everything in my field. I'll pick up everything in your field. Right? A Yid's a lamdan, and he figures this thing out. So, but Chazal were great lamdonim. Chazal understood the mentality. So he said, listen, in your field, you can't pick up anything because of the phony excuse that we spoke about several minutes ago. In your friend's field, the only thing you can pick up are the big rocks. And if he wants to, he can come into your field and pick up the big rocks. But there's not going to be any deals being made that you'll pick up everything. As a result, because you're not picking up everything, he's not going to be machzik tova. There's not going to be an appreciation that he cleaned up my field. Now I'm going to clean up. If Reuven came into Shimon's field and cleaned up his whole field, all the big ones, all the small ones, Shimon would feel indebted to go into Reuven's field, and he should do the same favor for him and pick up everything. So the Rav explains again on page 432 that Reuven can go into Shimon's field after the new rule, and Shimon can go into Reuven's field, and Reuven go back into Shimon's field after the new rule, and only collect the big rocks and the big twigs, not the small ones. Rav on page 432, left column, Shaloi b'toiva, she'ein chaveiroi machzik loy toiva. Reuven and Shimon can go into each other's field, and they collect the stones and the twigs in such a way that neither of them are overly thankful to the other. No hachzakas tov, no big thank yous. Now, no one is going to pick up the small ones. If, and the Mishnah will give you an example in a moment, if Reuven were allowed to show some kind of appreciation to Shimon, and Shimon were allowed to show some appreciation to Reuven. For example, Reuven cleans up Shimon's field. So he picks up the big ones after the new rule. Reuven picks up all the stones, big and small, in Shimon's field. And Shimon feels indebted to Reuven. Wow, he cleaned up my field. You know what? I owe him a big thank you. And you know what? I'm going to go into his field. I'm going to clean up his whole field too. I feel indebted to him. He cleaned up my whole field. I'm going into his field, clean up his whole field. So we're back to the same place we were. Either Reuven and Shimon will make deals between each other, or if we allow them to do whatever they want, it'll just naturally happen. Reuven will clean up Shimon's whole field. It's true. Reuven will clean up Shimon's whole field because he wants the rocks for construction. But then Shimon will feel indebted to Reuven. He cleaned my whole field. I'm going to go clean his whole field. So we're back to square one. So the only way to avoid this tremendous sense of appreciation is Reuven goes into Shimon's field and he picks up some of the big rocks. And Shimon doesn't feel tremendously indebted to Reuven because after all, he didn't clean up really his field. There's plenty of pebbles, there's plenty of rocks, there's plenty of twigs all over the place. What did Reuven do for me already? He took some of the big rocks out of my field because he needs it for his own purposes to build something. I don't owe him anything. In fact, he owes me something because he took my rocks. So Shimon doesn't feel indebted to Reuven, and therefore Shimon will not go back into Reuven's field to clean it up because Reuven didn't do anything for Shimon. Reuven took big rocks out of Shimon's field, and he probably needs it for construction. So what does Shimon feel indebted to Reuven? Shimon doesn't feel indebted to Reuven. Adarabah. Shimon did a Reuven a favor. He let him take the big rocks. Therefore, Shimon doesn't feel indebted to go into Reuven's field and take big rocks out of his field. He didn't clean up his field. But if Chazal would have allowed Reuven to go into Shimon's field and pick up everything, then Shimon would feel indebted to Reuven for having cleaned up his whole field, and Shimon would go into Reuven's field and clean up his whole field. We're back to square one. So therefore, we have this rule. The old rule was you can collect in your own field the big rocks, but not the small ones. The new rule was in your own field, you collect nothing. Under the old rule, someone came into your field with your permission, he can collect everything. Under the new rule, someone comes into your field with your permission, he can only collect the big rocks and the big twigs. So this way you don't feel indebted to him to go into his field and clean up everything there, and then we would be back to square one. So those are the old rules, and that's the new rule. Back to page 432. Hiskinu sheizeh malakid mitoich shel zeh v'zeh malakid mitoich shel zeh shaloi b'toiva. The takana was that each person can go into someone else's field and pick up big rocks and big twigs, shaloi b'toiva, in a way that you don't have to be thankful to the person that he cleaned up your field, so you won't be indebted to go back into his field. We'd be back at square one. And now the Mishnah says, "Ve'ein sarach leiman," I certainly don't have to tell you, sheyakatzes lahem mezaynis. You certainly, if you take a look at the Rav on page 433, the top Rav, "Ve'ein sarach loma sheyakatzes lahem mezaynis." Certainly, Reuven can't say to Shimon, if you come into my field and you collect the rocks, I'm going to give you a geshmaka steak dinner. You cannot offer anything to a person. Shimon comes to Reuven and says, Reuven, I'd like permission to collect rocks from your field. We're talking now under the new rule. And Shimon knows he can only collect the big rocks. So Shimon says to Reuven, I'd like to come into your field and collect the rocks in your field. And Reuven says, sure, you can collect the big rocks in my field. And you know what? I'm going to throw in a steak dinner for you. The problem there is that Shimon can feel indebted to Reuven, and he'll start collecting the small ones too. So that's certainly prohibited under the new rule. Or even worse, Reuven directly says to Shimon, how about coming into my field and collecting the rocks? And I'll give you a free steak meal. Oh, if Reuven offers Shimon a free steak meal for collecting the rocks, what kind of rocks will Shimon collect? He's not going to collect the big ones and leave the small ones. If Reuven offers him a steak, we understand the hint. Shimon is going to clean up the whole field. So you can't, again, not only can't you do something that will result in Shimon feeling indebted to you, and therefore he'll clean the field, you certainly can't offer Shimon anything to clean your field, because then he'll certainly clean the whole field, big and small rocks. So this is one problem Chazal were dealing with, over Aveira. People who weren't that concerned about being shomer Shemitah, and they created all kinds of problems and phony excuses, and Chazal had to deal with this. And we have a situation in this Mishnah, Misharabu over Aveira. The people who were not following the laws of Shemitah became so numerous, Chazal had to step in and make new rules. We're going to begin Mishnah Beis today, just to give us a little more historical perspective of what Chazal had to deal with. Sodashen is kavtza, a field that the owner of the field removed thorn bushes in the field. Tizara b'motzoi Shviis, you can still plant it in the 8th year. This is going to be a whole sugya that we're going to learn about. It's a field that's called ne'evad. What happens if someone actually worked his field during Shemitah? He plowed his field, he took rocks out of his field, he fertilized his field, he did all kinds of things in his field in the 7th year to prepare it for the 8th year. Many cases, it's prohibited to plant that field in the 8th year. If you work the field in the 7th year, ne'evad, then under most circumstances, you cannot use that field in the 8th year. So we're going to leave that alone for a moment. In the case of an owner of a field who removed thorns from his field, you can still plant the field in the 8th year. What I wanted to focus in is the next word, sheni taiva. Okay, now take a look. Sheni taiva means tov. The field was made very good. What does nitaiva mean? Let's take a look at the Rav. It's going to give us a very interesting perspective of what Chazal are dealing with here. On page 433, the second line of the Rav, Sheni Taiva. Shenechvasha Heitev. The field was plowed very well. Shekol ha'olam chorshim pam achas. All the Jews were permitted to plow their fields during Shemitah only one time. And he plowed his field 2 times so that the field was nitaiva. It was a real good field. He plowed his field twice during Shemitah, and you're only allowed to plow your field once during Shemitah. Everybody should be jumping out of their seats. What is the Rav talking about? You're not allowed to plow your field during Shemitah at all. It's already that quote unquote a biblical prohibition. Besides the four avodos, the 4 types of work enumerated in Parshas Bahar, there's a 5th malacha that we consider biblically prohibited, which is plowing. It's so prohibited that we learned in the first perek that in Tosfos Shviis, so we should mention have Tosfos Shviis this year with the Binyan Beis Hamikdash. When there's Tosfos Shviis, you can't even plow at certain times during the 6th year. What is the Rav talking about that you're allowed to plow a field once in the 7th year, but not twice? Rav continues and explains. This Mishnah is talking about when observing Shemitah became dangerous. When did it become dangerous? The foreign governments, let's take the Romans. The Romans conquered Eretz Yisrael, and people had to pay a tax on the amount of produce that the field made. Now, you couldn't file your tax return with the Roman government in Shemitah and say, I have no produce to give you because Jews don't work their field in the 7th year. It wasn't in the Roman tax code that you got an exemption for Shemitah. If you didn't pay your taxes, you can get killed by the Romans. So we have now a new situation Chazal have to deal with. Shail of Sakana. Malchus Oinesis al Hamas. The government would force people to pay the taxes on their fields. Hamut lakakois. Vihitiru, Chazal gave people permission. Imagine this. It is biblically prohibited to plow a field in Shemitah, But to protect the life of Jewish people, Chazal said, we will allow you to plow your field in Shemitah. V'hitiru lachrosh b'Shviis. They permitted Jewish people to plow a field in Shviis, kidei litein hamas hakosav mitvuasa l'melech, in order to be able to give produce from the field in Shemitah to the king to protect Jewish lives. So they Chazal made a rule, you can plow your field one time to be able to plant it and grow some produce to pay off the king's tax. However, if you plowed your field twice, which was not permitted, Chazal said you can plow it once just to be able to get some things growing there to pay your tax. And this, Shmelka decided that if Chazal said you can plant it once, you can plow it once, I can plow it twice, so it'll be a ganz geschmacka field and it'll grow a lot. Kansur Rabbanan. So the Chachamim gave this guy a penalty, and they said that if you plowed your field twice during Shemitah, you will be prohibited from planting in the 8th year. The Charisha Achas Yitiru, Chazal permitted one plowing, velo shtei charishos, but not two plowings. We'll go into this more, how Chazal permitted a biblical prohibition during these times, but this is another problem Chazal are dealing with. You've got the problem of Jews who are oivri avera, they're simply not interested in observing Shemitah. Not only they're not interested in observing Shemitah, but they come up with phony excuses for their neighbors about how they really are observing Shemitah, and they create problems for the whole area of farmers. Now we have another problem. The government, the foreign government, the Romans, who want to collect taxes during Shemitah and don't give you a tax exemption for Shemitah, what do we do now? We don't want Jews to get killed because of Shemitah. What are we going to do? So Chazal made a rule that once during Shemitah you can plow your fields, you can grow some produce and pay your taxes so that you can save your life. The value to keep Jews healthy and safe jumps out again from this Mishnah, which we've spoken about many, many times, how it is built into the halacha, with the exceptions, of course, of Yahorig Val Yavar, Avodah Zarah, Gil Yarai, Shvichas Damim, where a Jew has to be willing to die before he does the Avera, and the other exceptions under Shas Hashmad, Lahaver Al Das. Except for those, a Jew has a commandment, V'chai Bahem V'lo Shayamus Bahem. A Jew has a commandment from HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Parashas Acharei Mos, V'chai Bahem, you shall live with the Torah. You do not die for the Torah except when I, God, tell you when to die for the Torah. Otherwise, you don't make up your own rules. And the health of a Yid, the safety of a Yid, Chazal dealt with it, and they said, go plow your field to pay your taxes, said the Romans don't put you in jail, or the Romans don't punish you, the Romans don't kill you.